Chapter 9. Criticism. What shall we say of this philosophy? Perhaps nothing rapturous. It is difficult to be enthusiastic about Aristotle, because it was difficult for him to be enthusiastic about anything. And si vis me flere, primum tibi flendum. Footnote: if you wish me to weep, you must weep first. Horace, Ars Poetica, Two Actors and Writers. End footnote. His motto is nihil admirari, to admire or marvel at nothing, and we hesitate to violate his motto in his case. We miss in him the reforming zeal of Plato, the angry love of humanity which made the great idealist denounce his fellow men. We miss the daring originality of his teacher, the lofty imagination, the capacity for generous delusion, and yet, after reading Plato, nothing could be so salutary for us as Aristotle's sceptic calm. Let us summarize our disagreement. We are bothered at the outset with his insistence on logic. We want him to describe his ideal, and he describes a perfect syllogism. Not content with that, he makes his syllogism judge of our ideals. He thinks the syllogism is a description of man's way of reasoning, whereas it merely describes man's way of dressing up his reasoning for the persuasion of another mind. He supposes that thought begins with premises and seeks their conclusions, when actually thought begins with hypothetical conclusions and seeks their justifying premises, and seeks them best by the observation of particular events under the controlled and isolated conditions of experiment. Yet how foolish we should be to forget that 2000 years have changed merely the incidentals of Aristotle's logic, that Occam and Bacon and Whewell and Mill and 100 others have but found spots in his sun, and that Aristotle's creation of this new discipline of thought and his firm establishment of its essential lines remain among the lasting achievements of the human mind. It is again the absence of experiment and fruitful hypothesis that leaves Aristotle's natural science a mass of undigested observations. His specialty is the collection and classification of data. In every field he wields his categories and produces catalogues. But side by side with this bent and talent for observation goes a Platonic addiction to metaphysics. This trips him up in every science, and inveigles him into the wildest presuppositions. Here indeed was the great defect of the Greek mind. It was not disciplined. It lacked limiting and steadying traditions. It moved freely in an uncharted field, and ran too readily to theories and conclusions. So Greek philosophy leaped on to heights yet unreached again, while Greek science limped behind. Our modern danger is precisely opposite. Inductive data fall upon us from all sides like the lava of Vesuvius. We suffocate with uncoordinated facts. Our minds are overwhelmed with sciences, breeding and multiplying into specialistic chaos for want of synthetic thought and a unifying philosophy. We are all mere fragments of what a man might be. Aristotle's ethics is a branch of his logic. The ideal life is like a proper syllogism. He gives us a handbook of propriety rather than a stimulus to improvement. An ancient critic spoke of him as moderate to excess. An extremist might call the Ethics the champion collection of platitudes in all literature, and an Anglophobe would be consoled with the thought that Englishmen in their youth had done advance penance for the imperialistic sins of their adult years, since both at Cambridge and at Oxford they had been compelled to read every word of the Nicomachean Ethics. One longs to mingle fresh green leaves of grass with these drier pages, to add Whitman's exhilarating justification of sense-joy to Aristotle's exaltation of a purely intellectual happiness. One wonders if this Aristotelian ideal of a moderate moderation has had anything to do with the colourless virtue, the starched perfection, the expressionless good form of the British aristocracy. Matthew Arnold tells us that in his time Oxford tutors looked upon the Ethics as infallible. For 300 years this book and the Politics have formed the ruling British mind, perhaps to great and noble achievements, but certainly to a hard and cold efficiency. One wonders what the result would have been if the masters of the greatest of empires had been nurtured instead on the holy fervour and the constructive passion of the Republic. After all, Aristotle was not quite Greek. He had been settled and formed before coming to Athens. There was nothing Athenian about him, nothing of the hasty and inspirited experimentalism which made Athens throb with political élan, and at last helped to subject her to a unifying despot. He realized too completely the Delphic command to avoid excess. He is so anxious to pare away extremes that at last nothing is left. He is so fearful of disorder that he forgets to be fearful of slavery. He is so timid of uncertain change that he prefers a certain changelessness that near resembles death. He lacks the Heraclitean sense of flux which justifies the conservative in believing that all permanent change is gradual, but justifies the radical in believing that no changelessness is permanent. He forgets that Plato's communism was meant only for the elite, the unselfish and ungreedy few, and he comes deviously to a Platonic result when he says that though property should be private, its use should be as far as possible common. He does not see, and perhaps he could not be expected in his early day to see, that private control of the means of production was stimulating and salutary only when these means were so simple as to be purchasable by any man, and that their increasing complexity and cost lead to a dangerous centralization of ownership and power, and to an artificial and finally disruptive inequality. But after all, these are quite inessential criticisms of what remains the most marvellous and influential system of thought ever put together by any single mind. It may be doubted if any other thinker has contributed so much to the enlightenment of the world. Every later age has drawn upon Aristotle and stood upon his shoulders to see the truth. The varied and magnificent culture of Alexandria found its scientific inspiration in him. His Organon played a central role in shaping the minds of the medieval barbarians into disciplined and consistent thought. The other works translated by Nestorian Christians into Syriac in the 5th century A.D., and thence into Arabic and Hebrew in the 10th century, and thence into Latin towards 1225, turned scholasticism from its eloquent beginnings in Abelard to encyclopedic completion in Thomas Aquinas, 1227 to 1274. The Crusaders brought back more accurate Greek copies of the philosophers' texts, and the Greek scholars of Constantinople brought further Aristotelian treasures with them when, after 1453, they fled from the besieging Turks. The works of Aristotle came to be for European philosophy what the Bible was for theology, an almost infallible text with solutions for every problem. In 1215, the papal legate at Paris forbade teachers to lecture on his works. In 1231, Gregory IX appointed a commission to expurgate him. By 1260, he was de rigueur in every Christian school, and ecclesiastical assemblies penalized deviations from his views. Chaucer describes his student as happy by having at his bedeshead 20 bookes clothed in black or red, of Aristotle and his Philosophiae. And in the first circles of hell, says Dante, I saw the master there of those who know, amid the philosophic family, by all admired and by all reverenced. There Plato too I saw, and Socrates, who stood beside him closer than the rest. Such lines give us some inkling of the honour which 1,000 years offered to the Stagirite. Not till new instruments accumulated observations, and patient experiments remade science, and gave irresistible weapons to Occam and Ramus, to Roger and Francis Bacon, was the reign of Aristotle ended. No other mind had for so long a time ruled the intellect of mankind. End of section 10. Chapter 10. Later Life and Death. Meanwhile life had become unmanageably complicated for our philosopher. He found himself on the one hand embroiled with Alexander for protesting against the execution of Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle, who had refused to worship Alexander as a god, and Alexander had answered the protest by hinting that it was quite within his omnipotence to put even philosophers to death. At the same time, Aristotle was busy defending Alexander among the Athenians. He preferred Greek solidarity to city patriotism, and thought culture and science would flourish better when petty sovereignties and disputes were ended. And he saw in Alexander what Goethe was to see in Napoleon, the philosophic unity of a chaotic and intolerably manifold world. The Athenians, hungering for liberty, growled at Aristotle and became bitter when Alexander had a statue of the philosopher put up in the heart of the hostile city. In his turmoil we get an impression of Aristotle quite contrary to that left upon us by his Ethics. Here is a man not cold and inhumanly calm, but a fighter pursuing his titanic work in a circle of enemies on every side. The successors of Plato at the Academy, the oratorical school of Isocrates, and the angry crowds that hung on Demosthenes' acid eloquence, intrigued and clamoured for his exile or his death. And then suddenly, in 323 BC, Alexander died. Athens went wild with patriotic joy, the Macedonian party was overthrown, and Athenian independence was proclaimed. Antipater, successor of Alexander and intimate friend of Aristotle, marched upon the rebellious city. Most of the Macedonian party fled. Eurymedon, a chief priest, brought in an indictment against Aristotle, charging him with having taught that prayer and sacrifice were of no avail. Aristotle saw himself fated to be tried by juries and crowds incomparably more hostile than those that had murdered Socrates. Very wisely he left the city, saying that he would not give Athens a chance to sin a second time against philosophy. There was no cowardice in this. An accused person at Athens had always the option of preferring exile. Arrived at Chalcis, Aristotle fell ill. Diogenes Laertius tells us that the old philosopher, in utter disappointment with the turn of all things against him, committed suicide by drinking hemlock. However induced, his illness proved fatal, and a few months after leaving Athens, 322 BC, the lonely Aristotle died. In the same year, and at the same age, 62, Demosthenes, greatest of Alexander's enemies, drank poison. Within 12 months, Greece had lost her greatest ruler, her greatest orator, and her greatest philosopher. The glory that had been Greece faded now in the dawn of the Roman sun, and the grandeur that was Rome was the pomp of power rather than the light of thought. And then that grandeur too decayed, that little light went almost out. For 1,000 years darkness brooded over the face of Europe. All the world awaited the resurrection of philosophy. End of chapter 11. Recording by Pamela Nagami, M.D. in Encino, California, February 2021. End of the story of Aristotle's philosophy by Will Durant.